His lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. Every breath was a ragged gasp, tearing at his throat, puffing out into the freezing night air like white smoke signals for the man hunting him. The woods were dense here, unforgiving. Pine branches whipped against his face, leaving stinging welts that he couldn't even feel through the adrenaline. He just kept moving, stumbling over exposed roots, sliding on slick needles, pushing through the suffocating darkness that seemed to swallow the world whole. The 12th of February, 1998. The deep woods of Washington State. It was supposed to be quiet out here, peaceful, the kind of silence that people pay money for, the kind that soothes a weary soul after a long week of work. But tonight, that silence was heavy, oppressive. It amplified the snapping of twigs under his boots like gunshots. It magnified the thumping of his own heart, a drum beating a frantic rhythm against his rib cage. Asterisk thump, 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 asterisk. He stopped for a split second, leaning against the rough bark of a towering Douglas fir, trying to listen past the blood rushing in his ears. He needed to know if he'd lost him. He needed to believe that the nightmare was over, that he had outrun the shadow that had pulled him from the road. And then he heard it. Click. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a growl. It was the distinct, mechanical sound of a flashlight switch engaging. A beam of white light sliced through the darkness, cutting between the trees like a physical blade. It didn't waver. It didn't shake. It was steady, controlled, calm. The person holding that light wasn't panicking. He wasn't rushing. He was hunting. The runner pushed off the tree, his legs burning with lactic acid, forcing himself to move again. But the light was closer now. The footsteps behind him were methodical. Crunch, crunch, crunch. No urgency, just the terrifying certainty of a predator who knows the prey has nowhere left to go. He saw the edge of the ravine too late. His foot slipped on the wet moss. The world tilted. He scrambled, fingers clawing at the dirt, nails tearing against the earth, trying to find purchase, trying to stop the fall. He managed to grab a root, hanging there, suspended over the black void below. He looked up, desperate, pleading. The beam of light hit him full in the face, blinding him. He couldn't see the man standing above him. He couldn't see the face that looked so painfully ordinary, so forgettable. He could only see the silhouette of a hand reaching down, not to help, not to save, but to finish what had started. Miles back on that lonely stretch of highway, the hand closed around his wrist. The screen of his life faded to black. Most monsters we imagine live in the shadows. They are outliers, deviants, drifters who exist on the fringes of society, visible only when they strike. We tell ourselves we can spot them. We tell ourselves that evil has a face, that it looks twisted, ugly, wrong. We believe that if a monster walked into our grocery store, or sat in the pew next to us at church, or coached our children's little league team, we would know. We would feel the cold emanating from them. But that is a lie. The most dangerous monsters are the ones who look exactly like us. They are the ones who mow their lawns on Saturdays, the ones who wave to the mailman, the ones who wear a badge of normalcy so polished, so convincing, that they become invisible. For 15 years, a predator stalked the Pacific Northwest, operating with such terrifying efficiency that police didn't even know they were looking for a serial killer. He didn't just blend in. He was woven into the very fabric of the community. He was trusted. He was respected. He was the guy you called when you were in trouble. While families slept soundly in their beds, believing they were safe, he was out there, watching, waiting, planning. He left behind a trail of missing persons, reports that gathered dust in filing cabinets. 15 years, dozens of victims, no leads, no suspects, just a void where human lives used to be. He didn't have a terrifying nickname. He didn't send taunting letters to the press. He simply existed in two worlds. In one, he was a dedicated family man, a pillar of his town. In the other, he was a hollow shell devoid of empathy, driven by a dark, insatiable compulsion to control, to dominate, to destroy. This isn't just a story about a killer. It is a story about the failure of intuition. It is about the terrifying realization that the person you trust most, the neighbor you share a fence with, the man you smile at every morning, might be hiding a secret so dark it defies comprehension. They say you never truly know who your neighbors are. By the time this story is over, you'll realize you never want to know. Because sometimes the monster isn't under the bed. Sometimes he's the one unlocking the front door. The 5 freeway is a river of light cutting through the darkness of Southern California. It is a concrete vein pumping life, commerce, and thousands of souls into the beating heart of Los Angeles. But in the mid-1970s, for a specific kind of predator, it wasn't just a road. It was a hunting ground, a place where the transient nature of life met the anonymity of the night. It is the 14th of May, 1975. Keith Seller, a 21-year-old Marine, stands on the shoulder of a freeway on-ramp. The air smells of exhaust and cooling asphalt. He sticks out his thumb. It's a common sight in this era, a time before danger was a mantra drilled into every schoolchild, a time when hitchhiking was just a way to get from the base to a bar, or from a girlfriend's house back to the barracks. Keith is young. He is fit. He is trained to fight, trained to survive in hostile environments. He doesn't look like a victim. He looks like a protector. A brown Toyota Celica slows down. The passenger window rolls down. Inside sits a man who looks about as threatening as a tax accountant. He has a mustache, soft features, and a polite, almost diffident smile. He asks Keith where he's headed. He offers a ride. He offers a beer. Keith gets in. The door thuds shut, sealing out the noise of the highway. The car merges back into traffic, disappearing into the red stream of taillights. Keith Seller will never be seen alive again. 3 days later, his body is found in a drainage ditch in Long Beach. But this isn't just a murder. It is a desecration. The details are too grotesque for the morning papers, too sadistic for the police to fully comprehend. He hasn't just been killed. He has been used. He has been tortured. And then, when the man behind the wheel of that Celica was finished with his fun, Keith was discarded like a fast food wrapper on the side of the road. This was the work of Randy Stephen Kraft. And for the next decade, he would become the architect of a nightmare that would haunt the highways of California. Randy Kraft was born in 1945, and on paper he was the American dream personified. He was intelligent, boasting an IQ of 129. He was politically active, a staunch conservative who supported rigorous law and order. He had served in the Air Force. He had graduated from Claremont Men's College with a degree in economics. By the mid-70s, he was working as a computer consultant, a respectable, well-paying job in a burgeoning industry. He lived in a neat house. He had friends. He hosted bridge nights. To his neighbors, he was the nice guy who always remembered to bring a dip to the potluck. To his colleagues, he was the sharp mind who could solve complex coding problems. But Randy Kraft had a secret life, a compartmentalized existence that he managed with the same meticulous attention to detail he applied to his computer programs. He was gay in an era and a culture that forced that identity into the shadows. He frequented the gay bars of Long Beach and Orange County, places like the Ripples and the Golden Bear. But he wasn't looking for a partner. He wasn't looking for love. He was looking for subjects. Kraft's methodology was chillingly consistent. It was a routine he perfected over years, a script he followed with religious devotion. He targeted young men, Marines, hitchhikers, drifters, men who were often in transit, men whose disappearance might not be noticed for a day or two. or a week. Men on the margins. He would drive his car, often for hours, scanning the roadside. When he found a target, he would play the role of the Good Samaritan. He was disarming. He was soft-spoken. He didn't trigger the alarm bells that a more aggressive predator might. Once the victim was in the car, the ritual began. It almost always started with alcohol. Kraft would offer a beer, maybe two, but the beer was just the delivery system. Dissolved within the amber liquid were massive doses of Valium, lorazepam, or other tranquilizers. He didn't use a weapon to subdue them. He used chemistry. He would drive and chat, keeping the conversation light, asking about their lives, their families, their dreams. And as the miles rolled by, the victim would start to feel heavy. Their speech would slur. Their eyelids would droop. They would attribute it to the alcohol, to the fatigue of the road. They would trust the nice man in the passenger seat. They would close their eyes, thinking they would just rest for a moment. They would wake up in hell. What Kraft did to his victims once they were incapacitated is the stuff of nightmares. He didn't just want to kill them. Death was the end, the period at the end of the sentence. Kraft was interested in the paragraph before it. He wanted to prolong the suffering. He wanted total, absolute control. Between 1975 and 1980, bodies began to pile up along the freeways of Southern California, the I-5, the 405, the 605. The arteries of the state became a graveyard. The 31st of December, 1975. Mark Hall, 22 years old. January 1976. Unidentified John Doe. February 1976. Scott Hughes, 18. The list grew. The names were written in police reports, typed onto index cards, filed away in cabinets that were slowly overflowing. But for years, no one connected the dots. Why? Because the victims were scattered. Different jurisdictions, different police departments. The Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, the Long Beach Police, the Orange County Sheriff, the California Highway Patrol. In the 1970s, these agencies didn't talk to each other. There were no computerized databases linking a body found in a ditch in Orange County to a body found on an off-ramp in San Diego. And there was another reason, a darker reason. The victims were young men, often found with drugs in their systems. To the overworked detectives of the time, these were high-risk lifestyle deaths. Overdoses, drifters, homosexual encounters gone wrong. Society didn't look at these dead boys and see the work of a serial predator. They saw the consequences of a counterculture they didn't understand and didn't care to save. Randy Kraft knew this. He banked on it. He used the apathy of the system as a shield. He was the ultimate predator because he was patient. He didn't kill in a frenzy. He killed with a plan. He had a cooling off period. But it wasn't because of remorse. It was because he had a day job. He had bills to pay. He had a life to maintain. During the week, he was Mr. Kraft, the computer guy. He wore a tie. He sat in meetings. He discussed algorithms and data processing. He went to dinner parties and made small talk about local politics. He complained about the traffic, the same traffic he used to dispose of human beings. On the weekends, he became the butcher, and he kept score. This is the detail that separates Kraft from almost any other killer in history. He kept a list, a coded, cryptic list on a notepad, usually kept in the trunk of his car or in his home office. It was a ledger of death. 2 columns. On the left, a name or a nickname. On the right, a cryptic phrase, stable, Marine, 2 inches 1, Horthoff. These weren't just scribbles. They were mementos. Each entry represented a human life, extinguished. Marine likely referred to Keith Seller or one of the many other servicemen he targeted. 2 inches 1 referred to a night where he picked up 2 victims at once. Hawth off referred to a body dumped at the Hawthorne off-ramp. Kraft was documenting his crimes like an accountant tracking expenses. It was an act of supreme arrogance. He believed he was smarter than the police. He believed he was untouchable, and for a long time, he was right. By 1978, the pace of the killing had accelerated. The demon inside him was hungry, and the hunger was growing. The 16th of April 1978. Scott Michael Hughes, 18 years old, a high school student. He had his whole life ahead of him. He was found strangled, his body dumped near an on-ramp in Anaheim. His shoelaces had been removed. This was a signature. Kraft often removed the shoelaces to use as ligatures or simply as a trophy. The 11th of June 1978. Roland Young, 23. The 19th of June 1978. Richard Keith, 20. The 6th of July 1978. Keith Klingbeil, 23. 3 young men in less than a month. The frenetic energy of the killing was ramping up. Kraft was taking risks. He was picking up victims in areas where he had been seen before. He was dumping bodies closer together. But still, the silence from the authorities was deafening. There was no task force, no press conference warning young men to stay off the roads. The freeway killer moniker hadn't been coined yet, or at least it hadn't been pinned to just one man. Because unbeknownst to the public, there were actually 3 separate serial killers operating on the California freeways at the same time. William Bonin, Patrick Kearney, and the most prolific of them all, Randy Kraft. It was a perfect storm of evil, a convergence of predators that allowed each one to hide in the shadow of the others. If a body was found, was it Bonin? Was it Kearney? Or was it this third, ghostly figure who left no fingerprints, no witnesses, and no DNA evidence that 1970s science could analyze? By the dawn of the 1980s, Randy Kraft was operating with impunity. He had refined his torture methods. He began to keep more than just a list. He kept items, belts, lighters, photos. He would take pictures of his victims in their final moments or just after death. He posed them. He opened their eyes. He wanted to capture the exact moment when the person became an object. He kept these photos hidden in his house, tucked away in envelopes, sandwiched between mundane documents about taxes and car insurance. It was his private gallery. When the urge to kill struck him during the work week, when he couldn't get out to the highway, he would take out the photos. He would relive the power. He would trace the lines of his victims' faces with his finger, remembering the smell of the car, the sound of the road, the feeling of the ligature tightening. 1,980, 1,980, 1,980, 2. The years blurred together in a haze of bloodshed. Michael Inderbitten, 21 years old, found in November 1978. He had been violated with a foreign object so severely that the medical examiner had to step out of the room. Donald Crizel, 20 years old, found June 1979. Robert Loggins, 19 years old, found September 1980. Loggins was a Marine. He was tough. He was strong. But against the cocktail of drugs, Kraft slipped him. His strength meant nothing. His body was found in a discarded sleeping bag. Police took photos of the scene, filed the report, and moved on. Another dead Marine. Another unsolved mystery. But as the body count rose into the 30s, and then the 40s, whispers began to circulate in the gay community. Stories about a man in a Toyota. Stories about a nice guy who offered rides and drinks. But the community was insular, wary of the police who often harassed them. The information stayed in the shadows, just like the killer. In 1983, Kraft made a trip to Oregon. He was there on business, representing his computer firm. He was efficient, professional, the model employee. But the darkness traveled with him. While in Oregon, he picked up a young hustler. He drugged him. He strangled him. He dumped him in a remote wooded area. Even hundreds of miles from his hunting grounds, Kraft couldn't stop. The compulsion was a parasite that had completely taken over the host. Back in California, the cracks were starting to show. Not in Kraft's demeanor, he remained as cool and collected as ever, but in the sheer statistical improbability of his evasion. You can only roll the dice so many times before they come up snake eyes. You can only dump so many bodies before someone sees a license plate, before a patrol car turns a corner at the wrong second. But it would take a simple traffic stop to bring the house of cards down. It is strictly about the years leading up to the fall, the years where he built his legacy of pain, the years where he was the architect. Imagine the arrogance. Imagine driving to work on a Monday morning, wearing a suit and tie, nodding to the security guard, pouring a cup of coffee in the break room. Imagine sitting at a desk, debugging code, while the pictures of a dead boy are sitting in the trunk of your car in the parking lot. Imagine going to a dinner party on Friday night, laughing at a joke, eating steak, while knowing that in 4 hours you will be hunting. This was the duality of Randy Kraft. He wasn't a monster who lived in a cave. He was a monster who lived next door. He was a monster who did your taxes. He was a monster who stood in line behind you at the grocery store. And the most terrifying part? He looked so normal. He looked so safe. There were close calls, moments where the mask almost slipped. In 1980, a young man named Roger Duvall was found dead on a mountainside. Near his body was a pristine, folded paper bag. Inside the bag were prescription drugs. The prescription was traced. It didn't lead to Kraft, but it led to a pharmacy in Long Beach that Kraft frequented. It was a thread, a tiny, fragile thread, but the detectives pulled on it, and it snapped. The connection wasn't made. In 1982, Kraft was pulled over for an erratic lane change. The officer walked up to the window. Kraft smiled. He was calm. He was polite. He explained he was just tired from a long day at work. The officer shone his flashlight into the back seat. Empty. He let him go, with a warning. Kraft drove away, his heart rate likely unchanged. He had mastered the art of camouflage. He knew that evil doesn't look like a demon with horns. It looks like a middle-aged man in a windbreaker. But by 1983, the era of the freeway killers was reaching its crescendo. William Bonin had been caught. The public was on edge. The police were under immense pressure. The media was finally paying attention. The term serial killer was entering the lexicon. The FBI was developing profiling techniques. The net was tightening, even if Kraft didn't feel it yet. He continued to refine his scorecard. The list grew longer. MKHB, Oxnard, Portland, Tishalou. Each entry a life cut short. Each entry a universe of pain for the families left behind. Mothers who would never see their sons again. Fathers who would spend the rest of their lives wondering why. The sheer volume of his crimes during this decade is hard to comprehend. We are talking about dozens of men. Some estimates say nearly 70 victims. 70, a number that rivals the most infamous killers in history. Yet, ask the average person on the street who Randy Kraft is, and they will stare at you blankly. Why? Perhaps because his victims were men. Perhaps because the method was poison and strangulation, lacking the sensational gore of a chainsaw massacre. Or perhaps because Kraft was so boringly, terrifyingly normal that the media couldn't turn him into a caricature. He wasn't a clown like Gacy. He wasn't a charismatic law student like Bundy. He was just a guy, and that is what makes him the architect of pain. He built a structure of suffering, right in the middle of suburbia, and nobody noticed the construction. As 1984 approached, the endgame began. The patterns were undeniable. The bodies were appearing with rhythmic, sickening regularity. The police agencies were finally starting to talk. The separate investigations were beginning to merge. But Kraft didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The thrill of the capture, the total dominance of the kill, the secret pleasure of the scorecard, it was his oxygen. One night in the spring of 1983, he picked up a young man named Grau. Grau was suspicious. He sensed something off behind Kraft's polite exterior. When Kraft offered the beer, Grau hesitated. When Kraft insisted, Grau felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He asked to be let out, and remarkably, Kraft let him go. He pulled over. He unlocked the door. He watched Grau scramble out onto the shoulder. Why? Was it a moment of mercy? Unlikely. It was self-preservation. A struggling victim attracts attention. A suspicious victim leaves evidence. Kraft was a predator, not a brawler. He preferred the kill to be clean, quiet, controlled. He let Grau go because Grau wasn't the right prey. Grau survived. He walked away into the night, unaware that he had just looked into the eyes of the devil and lived to tell the tale. He wouldn't realize how close he came to being an entry on the scorecard until years later. But for every Grau, there were 10 others who didn't get out of the car. As we move toward the middle of the decade, the stage is set for the final act. The computer consultant is confident. The trunk is full of supplies. The scorecard has plenty of blank lines waiting to be filled. Randy Kraft believes he is smarter than everyone else. He believes he has created the perfect system for murder. He believes he will never be caught. But he is wrong, because on a warm night in May, on the side of the I-5 freeway, a California Highway Patrol officer is about to see a car parked oddly on the shoulder. He is going to see a man standing by the door, and he is going to decide to pull over and check it out. And that decision will unravel a decade of darkness. The diesel engine idles with a low, guttural growl, a rhythmic chugging that vibrates through the asphalt of the truck stop parking lot, shaking the puddles of oil and rainwater collecting in the potholes. It is 2 a.m. in West Memphis, Arkansas, 1986. The air smells of burnt rubber, stale coffee, and exhaust. Under the harsh buzz of sodium vapor lights, a massive 18-wheeler sits waiting. To the casual observer, it is just another rig in a sea of steel giants, a vessel of commerce moving goods from coast to coast. But to the man sitting behind the wheel, watching the lot through the dark tint of his windshield, it is something else entirely. It is a fortress, a dungeon on 18 wheels, and he is hunting. The interstate highway system in America is a marvel of engineering, a concrete web stretching over 46,000 miles, connecting cities, crossing deserts, and slicing through the heart of the wilderness. It was designed for speed, for efficiency, for the rapid movement of the military and the economy. But in the shadows of the off-ramps and the neon-soaked isolation of truck stops, it created a new kind of hunting ground, a place where jurisdiction ends at the county line, a place where a predator could pick up a victim in Texas, kill them in Oklahoma, and dump the body in Illinois, all within a single shift. The perfect crime for the perfect mobile killer. And in the mid-1980s, no one navigated this grey zone with more terrifying precision than the man in the cab. His name was Robert Ben Rhodes. To the dispatchers and fellow truckers, he was just another driver. Polite, intelligent, perhaps a little too meticulous about his rig. He drove a sprawling Peterbilt tractor, gleaming with chrome, the interior modified with obsessive care. But the modifications weren't for comfort. They were for control. Rhodes had transformed the sleeper cab, the small living space behind the driver's seat, into a soundproof, mobile torture chamber. He had installed handcuffs welded directly to the frame. He had reinforced the doors. He had created a world where the laws of society did not apply, a world that moved at 70 miles per hour down the interstate, hiding in plain sight. 1986. 986 marked a shift, a darkening. Rhodes had been driving for years, but the compulsion was evolving. He wasn't just looking for sex, he was looking for ownership. He targeted the people America had forgotten. The hitchhikers, the runaways, the young women standing by the on-ramps, with their thumbs out, looking for adventure or escape, unaware that they were signaling a monster. February. The winter wind cuts across the plains of Texas. A young woman, nameless in the police files for years, stands on the shoulder of I-10. She is cold. She is tired. When the massive truck slows down, the air breaks hissing like a serpent. She doesn't see a threat. She sees warmth. She sees a ride to the next town. She climbs up the steps, the metal cold against her hands, and pulls the heavy door shut. The cab is warm. The driver smiles. He is well-spoken, calm. He puts the truck in gear, and they merge back into traffic. The trap snaps shut. Miles pass. The conversation dwindles. The driver's demeanor shifts. It's subtle at first. A glance that lingers too long. A question that feels too invasive. And then, the click of a lock. The realization hits her not all at once, but in a slow, suffocating wave. She is trapped in a steel box moving through the void of the night. No one can hear her scream over the roar of the engine. No one can see her through the curtains drawn tight across the sleeper berth. Rhodes pulls over in a desolate rest area, miles from civilization. He doesn't just attack, he prepares. This is his ritual. The handcuffs come out, the mask slips. The soft-spoken driver vanishes, replaced by the sadist who demands total submission. He kept them for days, sometimes weeks. He drove with them shackled in the back, continuing his delivery routes as if nothing were wrong. He would stop at way stations, sign logbooks, chat with waitresses at diners, all while a human being lay bound and terrified just feet away behind a thin partition. It was a duality that defined his existence. The professional trucker on the surface, the depraved captor beneath. The bodies began to appear, but they didn't form a pattern. Not yet. A Jane Doe found in a ditch in Mississippi. A skeletal remain discovered in a cornfield in Ohio. A decomposing body pulled from the brush in Utah. The geography was the enemy of the investigation. In 1987, police departments didn't share databases. A murder in one state was rarely cross-referenced with a missing person report in another. The victims were often drifters, people whose disappearance didn't ring immediate alarm bells. They were high-risk lifestyles, a police euphemism that often meant not a priority. Rhodes knew this. He counted on it. He used the interstate as a weapon, scattering the evidence of his crimes across thousands of miles. He was a ghost in the machine of the American highway system. By 1988, the shadow was growing bolder. He wasn't just picking up solo hitchhikers anymore. He was experimenting, testing the limits of his control. He began to keep trophies, photos. He would photograph his victims in their final moments, documenting their terror with the eye of a collector. It wasn't enough to kill them. He needed to freeze their fear, to own it forever. The psychology of Robert Ben Rhodes was a tangled knot of sadism and intelligence. He wasn't a frenzy killer who lost control. He was calculated. He read books on torture. He studied the mechanics of pain. He viewed his truck not just as a vehicle, but as a sovereign nation where he was the dictator. He had a specific fantasy, one he tried to enact over and over again. He wanted a willing slave, someone who would submit to him completely. When they inevitably fought back, when the reality of the human spirit clashed with his twisted desires, he killed them. Disposal was clinical. He treated the bodies like hazardous cargo. He knew the decomposition rates. He knew the scavenger patterns. He dumped them in places where nature would do the work for him. Swamps, deserts, dense forests. He washed his truck. He bleached the floors. He sprayed air freshener to mask the scent of fear and death. Then he picked up his next load of lumber or steel and got back on the road. 1989. The peak of the violence. The interstate had become a conveyor belt of death. While roaders drove, families waited. Mothers stared out of windows in small towns, wondering why their daughters hadn't called. Fathers walked the streets, clutching faded photographs, asking strangers if they'd seen a girl with blue eyes and a hopeful smile. But the road gives up its secrets slowly. The turning point, or what should have been the turning point, came not from a brilliant detective deduction, but from the sheer volume of missing persons along the I-35 and I-10 corridors. Police in Texas started noticing a trend. Women were vanishing from truck stops, not just running away, but disappearing into thin air. A task force was whispered about, but never fully formed. The resources weren't there. The technology wasn't there. And then came Regina K. Walters. She was 14 years old. 14. A child from Pasadena, Texas, who had run away from home, looking for something better than what she had left behind. She and her boyfriend, Ricky Lee Jones, were hitchhiking. They were young, in love, and naive to the dangers of the world. They stuck out their thumbs. A shiny, meticulous Peterbilt pulled over. Roadies took them both. This was a deviation. Usually, he took women alone, but his confidence was at an all-time high. He felt untouchable. He killed Ricky almost immediately, discarding his body like refuse. But he kept Regina. For weeks, Regina K. Walters lived a nightmare that defies comprehension. She was trapped in the sleeper cab, hauled across the country. She saw the changing landscapes through the cracks in the curtains, the flatlands of the Midwest, the mountains of the West, the deserts of the Southwest. Every mile took her further from home, further from help. He cut her hair. He forced her to wear dresses he had bought. He made her pose. There is a photograph that was later found. It is perhaps one of the most haunting images in the history of true crime. It shows Regina in an abandoned barn in Illinois. She is wearing a black dress and heels. Her hair is cropped short. She is looking at the camera, at Rhodes. Her hands are raised in a defensive posture, her eyes wide, filled with a terror so pure, so raw, that it hurts to look at. In that moment, she knew she wasn't looking at a camera. She was looking at her executioner. He strangled her shortly after the photo was taken. He left her body in the barn, a broken doll in the dust and straw of the American heartland. Her discovery would eventually link the crimes. But in 1990, she was just another Jane Doe, another tragedy without a name. But arrogance is a killer's fatal flaw. Rhodes was getting careless. He was taking risks. He began to believe his own myth, that he was smarter than the police, that the truck made him invisible. The 1st of April 1990. Arizona. The sun is setting over the desert, painting the sky in bruised purples and fiery oranges. An Arizona Highway Patrol officer notices a tractor-trailer parked on the shoulder of I-10 with its hazard lights blinking. It looks like a breakdown, a routine check. The officer pulls up behind the rig, the gravel crunching under his tires. He walks up to the cab. The driver, Robert Ben Rhodes, is inside. But he isn't alone. There is a woman in the cab. She is handcuffed. She is screaming. But not with her voice, she is screaming with her eyes. She is naked, huddled in the sleeper berth, a horse bit strapped into her mouth to silence her. The officer freezes. This isn't a breakdown. This is a crime scene in progress. Rhodes smiles. He tries to explain. He tries to charm. It's a domestic dispute, he says. A game. But the officer sees the chains. He sees the modifications to the cab. He sees the look on the woman's face, the look of someone who has stared into the abyss and is praying for a hand to pull them back. The officer draws his weapon. Rhodes is arrested. The woman is saved. But as investigators begin to peel back the layers of Robert Ben Rhodes' life, they realize this isn't just a kidnapping. This is the tip of an iceberg so massive, so dark, that it chills them to the bone. They search the truck. It is a house of horrors. Whips, chains, torture devices, a collection of photos. And among those photos, the picture of a girl in a black dress, cowering in a barn. The timeline begins to collapse. 1990 to 1992 becomes a period of revelation. Police from across the country start calling Texas, Illinois, Ohio, Mississippi. Missing person files are dusted off. The dots are finally, tragically, connected. They found the logbooks. Rhodes was a meticulous record keeper. Every mile, every stop, every gallon of fuel was documented. Investigators began to overlay his route map with the locations of body dumps. The lines matched perfectly. Where the truck went, death followed. Regina K. Walters was identified. Her family finally got the answer they had dreaded. The body of the hitchhiker from 1986, linked. The bones in the cornfield, linked. But the true number? That remains the Interstate Shadow's final secret. Rhodes claimed he had killed over 50 women. He claimed he had been hunting for 15 years. Police could confirm 3 murders definitively. They suspected dozens more. The investigation revealed the systemic failures of law enforcement in the late 82nds. The lack of communication, the dismissal of victims on the margins of society, the assumption that a trucker moving through town was just a transient ghost, not a recurring nightmare. In 1992, as the legal proceedings ground forward, the full scope of his evil became public. People looked at the big rigs passing them on the highway differently. They looked at the sleeper cabs and wondered what was happening behind those heavy curtains. They realized that the road wasn't just a way to get from place to place. It was a wilderness, and in the wilderness, there are wolves. Rhodes didn't look like a monster in court. He looked like a grandfather. He wore glasses. He was overweight. He sat quietly, listening to the testimony, watching the families of his victims weep. He showed no remorse, no emotion, just a cold, detached curiosity, as if he were watching a movie about someone else. He pleaded guilty to the murder of Regina K. Walters in Illinois to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to life without parole. But the sentence felt hollow to the families. It didn't bring back the daughters who had stepped into that truck looking for a ride and found hell instead. The story of the Interstate Shadow is a story of mobility weaponized. It is the story of how a man took the symbol of American freedom, the open road, and turned it into a cage. But even with Rhodes behind bars, the highway didn't feel safer, because the terrifying truth that settled over the public consciousness in the early 92nds was this: Robert Ben Rhodes was caught by chance, a hazard light, a curious trooper. If he hadn't stopped that night in Arizona, if he hadn't been so arrogant, he would have kept driving, he would have kept hunting. And as you drive down the interstate tonight, watching the red taillights string out ahead of you like a river of rubies, remember the sound of the air brakes hissing in the dark. Remember the girl in the black dress. And remember that sometimes the monster isn't hiding under the bed. Sometimes he's in the lane right next to you, waving as he passes by. The 1980s ended, and the 92nds began. But the shadow on the interstate never really lifted. It just changed lanes. For every Robert Ben Rhodes who gets caught, there is the lingering question of who else is out there, keeping strict logbooks, modifying their cabs, and watching the shoulder of the road for the next lonely soul looking for a ride. The wheels keep turning, the miles keep rolling, and the silence of the missing stretches on, unbroken by the roar of the engines. The humidity in southern Louisiana doesn't just sit on the skin, it penetrates. It weighs you down, makes the air feel thick enough to choke on. and blurs the lines between the water, the earth, and the sky. By 1993, Ronald Dominique was drowning in it. He was approaching his 30th birthday, a milestone that for most men signals a settling down, a cementing of identity and purpose. But for Ronald, it was a reminder of everything he wasn't, everything he had failed to become. He was living a life of hollow repetition. To the people of Homer and Thibodeau, he was a fixture of the background, as unremarkable as a cracked sidewalk or a rusted street sign. He delivered pizzas. He clerked at convenience stores. He read utility meters, walking from house to house, peering into the domestic lives of strangers, observing the families and the normalcy that would forever be denied to him. He was the man you paid without making eye contact, the man who handed you your change while you looked at your watch. He was invisible, but invisibility is a double-edged sword. For the lonely, it is a curse. For the predator, it is a superpower. During these lost years, between 1993 and 1996, the man who would become the Bayou Strangler was molting. He was shedding the skin of the awkward, bullied child and growing something harder, something calloused and cruel underneath. He moved between cheap rental trailers and his sister's couch, a transient existence that left no permanent mark on the world. His financial dependence on his family was a source of quiet humiliation, a constant reminder of his inability to function as a real man in the rigid, hyper-masculine culture of the Deep South. His escape, his only true release, came when the sun went down. Ronald frequented the local gay bars, the smoky, dimly lit sanctuaries where men like him could supposedly be themselves. But even here, in the one place where he should have found community, Ronald was an outsider. He wasn't handsome. He wasn't charming. He was overweight, balding, and possessed a softness that others found off-putting. He would sit at the bar, nursing a drink, watching the younger, attractive men laugh and dance, his eyes tracking their movements with a mixture of desire and simmering resentment. He tried to buy his way in. He would offer to buy rounds of drinks he couldn't afford. He would offer rides. He would try to make himself useful, essential. But connection always eluded him. He was the guy you tolerated, not the guy you invited home, except when he was on stage. It was one of the most jarring contradictions of his life. The shy, soft-spoken meter reader had an alter ego. On drag nights, Ronald would transform. He would layer on the makeup, squeeze his heavy frame into sequins and gowns, and lip-sync to the powerhouse vocals of Patti LaBelle for 3 minutes at a time. He wasn't the loser from the trailer park. He was a diva. He was powerful. He commanded the room. People cheered for him. They looked at him. For a fleeting moment, he controlled the energy of everyone in that dark room. But the music always stopped. The lights always came up. And when the makeup was scrubbed off in a dirty bathroom mirror, the face staring back was still just Ronald, and the silence that followed the applause began to fill with a dark, festering rage. Psychologists often talk about the incubation period of a serial killer. It is rarely a sudden snap. It is a slow boil, a gradual erosion of boundaries. During these years, Ronald's fantasies began to shift. The rejection he faced in the bars, the mockery he had endured since childhood, the crushing weight of his own mediocrity, it all began to coalesce into a singular, dangerous need. He didn't just want to be with these men. He wanted to possess them. He wanted them to stop looking through him. He wanted them to be still. He began to refine his methods, though he hadn't yet crossed the line into murder. He learned the geography of the desperate. He realized that while the beautiful men in the bars might reject him, there was another class of men who couldn't afford to be so choosy. The drifters, the hitchhikers, the addicts looking for a quick fix. Men who walked the highways with their thumbs out, staring at the taillights of passing cars, hoping for salvation but settling for a ride. Ronald realized he had something they wanted. Not charm, not looks, but resources. A car, a few dollars, a place to sleep. He learned that in the economy of the streets, desperation lowers the price of intimacy. He began cruising the areas known for drug activity, the darker corners of Homer and Jefferson Parish. He practiced his pitch. He practiced the soft, non-threatening voice. He learned that if he presented himself as a harmless, slightly pathetic, middle-aged man, people let their guard down. They didn't see a threat. They saw a mark or a savior. He was testing the waters, testing his ability to lure, testing his ability to control. And then, on a stifling night in August 1996, the test became real. The incubation period was over. It is late. The air is thick, with the sound of cicadas and the distant hum of traffic. Ronald is staying at his sister's house while she is away. The house is empty, isolated, a private stage for what he has been rehearsing in his mind for years. He has picked up a man, a stranger. The specifics of the lure are a blueprint for the horror to come. The promise of alcohol, the suggestion of a party, the non-threatening demeanor that puts the victim at ease. They enter the house. The door closes, shutting out the rest of the world. Inside, the dynamic shifts. The soft-spoken man becomes demanding. The script flips. Ronald produces a weapon, or perhaps just the sheer force of his suppressed rage. He overpowers the man. He bends him. This is the moment. This is the crystallization of the fantasy. For the first time, Ronald Dominique has complete, total control. The man cannot leave. He cannot mock him. He cannot look away. He is forced to acknowledge Ronald's existence, forced to submit to his will. Ronald rapes him. It is an act of violence, not affection. It is a punishment for every rejection, every snicker, every moment of invisibility Ronald has endured for 32 years. But this time, he lets him go. The victim, traumatized and terrified, flees the house. He runs into the humid night, escaping the monster in the suburbs. And, crucially, he goes to the police. This should have been the end. This should have been the moment society intervened, the moment the system recognized the predator in its midst and caged him before he could evolve. Ronald was arrested. He was booked. The fingerprints were taken. The mugshot snapped. He sat in a holding cell, the metal bars separating him from the freedom he had abused. He was charged with forcible rape. The mask had slipped. The nice guy from the trailer park was exposed as a brutal sexual predator. He was facing significant prison time. He was facing the destruction of his life. But then, the system faltered. The wheels of justice in Louisiana, particularly for victims on the margins of society, often turn with a rusting, grinding slowness. The victim, the man who had stared into the eyes of a monster and survived, was a transient. He had no fixed address, no stable life, no resources to keep him tethered to the jurisdiction. When it came time to prepare for trial, the prosecutors reached out, but there was no one to answer. The victim had moved on, drifted away, disappeared, back into the stream of invisible men flowing through the South. Without a victim, there was no testimony. Without testimony, there was no case. The charges were dropped, the cell door unlocked. Ronald Dominique walked out into the blinding Louisiana sunshine, a free man. He would later claim in interviews that this arrest shattered him. He painted a picture of a man broken by a false accusation, a man sent spiraling into depression and madness by the injustice of the system. It was a narrative he crafted carefully, a way to frame himself as the victim, even as he was preparing to become the executioner. But the truth was likely far more sinister. The arrest didn't shatter him. It educated him. As he walked away from the courthouse, the lesson crystallized in his mind. He had made a mistake, yes, but it wasn't the rape, it wasn't the violence. His mistake was leaving a witness. His mistake was choosing someone who could talk. He realized that the police didn't care about men like his victim. They didn't look hard for them. They didn't expend resources to track them down. If a man like that could disappear from a court case, couldn't he also disappear from the world? The year 1996 bled into the winter of 1997. Ronald returned to his routine. He went back to the low-wage jobs. He went back to the trailers. He went back to the gay bars, standing in the shadows, sipping his drink, watching. But something was different now. The people looking at him saw the same soft, overweight, harmless nobody. But inside, the transformation was complete. He wasn't just watching anymore. He was shopping. He began to look at the men around him, not as potential partners, but as potential problems to be solved. He scrutinized their vulnerabilities. He looked for the ones who wouldn't be missed, the ones whose families had stopped answering their calls, the ones whose disappearances would be written off as a drug deal gone wrong or a drifter moving on to the next town. He tightened his criteria. He refined his script. He began to carry a kit in his vehicle: rope, tape, items that had innocent uses in isolation but, when combined, formed the toolkit of a killer. He drove the back roads of the parishes. He memorized the layout of the cane fields, where the stalks grew tall and thick, creating walls of green that could hide anything. He studied the bayous, learning which canals were stagnant, which waterways were choked with hyacinth, where the alligators gathered. He was mapping his dumping grounds before he even had a body to dump. The pressure was building again. The release he had found in the assault at his sister's house had been temporary, a hit of a drug that only left him craving more. The fantasy of control was no longer enough. The memory of the fear in that man's eyes was fading, and he needed to replenish it. He needed the ultimate control, the power, not just to bind, but to extinguish. By early 1997, Ronald Dominique was a loaded weapon waiting for a trigger. He was 33 years old. He had no career, no spouse, no children, no legacy. He had nothing to lose and a darkness to feed. The humiliation of his life, the bullying, the poverty, the closeted shame had been distilled into a poison that he was ready to inject into the world. He was simply waiting for the right person to cross his path, and he wouldn't have to wait long. The roads of Terrebonne and Lafourche parishes are long and dark. Streetlights are scarce once you leave the city limits. The darkness out there is absolute, a heavy black blanket that swallows everything. It is a place where a man walking alone is vulnerable, where a car pulling over to the shoulder looks like help, not danger. Ronald spent his nights patrolling these roads. He was patient. He was disciplined. He was the spider in the center of a very wide web. He knew that sooner or later, a fly would land. It is important to understand the banality of this evil. Ronald didn't look like a monster. He didn't have the charismatic madness of a Ted Bundy or the terrifying clown persona of a John Wayne Gacy. He looked like your neighbor. He looked like the guy fixing your air conditioner. He looked like someone you could trust, or at the very least, someone you could easily overpower if things went wrong. That was his greatest weapon, the underestimation. Every man he approached looked at Ronald Dominique and thought, I can handle him. They saw the paunch, the receding hairline, the soft hands. They calculated the risk and decided it was zero. They got into the car because they weren't afraid. They should have been. As the summer of 1997 approached, the heat in Louisiana began to rise, turning the swamps into steaming cauldrons. The air grew heavy with moisture and menace. Ronald was ready. The rehearsal was over. The stage was set. He was done being the victim. He was done being the joke. He was done being the man in the dress lip-syncing to someone else's power. He was about to seize a power that belonged only to God, the power to decide who breathes and who doesn't. And in July of 1997, on a stretch of highway in Harnville, A 19-year-old named David Mitchell was walking alone. He was young. He was likely thinking about his destination, his friends, his life ahead of him. He saw a vehicle slow down. He saw a man roll down the window. A man with a kind face. A man offering a ride out of the heat. David Mitchell didn't know he was looking at the end of his life. He didn't know that he was about to become the first line in a bloody chapter of Louisiana history that would span a decade. He just saw a ride. He opened the door. He got in. And the lost years of Ronald Dominique were over. The era of the Bayou Strangler had begun. Rain. It falls relentlessly on the Pacific Northwest, washing away the grime of the city, slicking the streets of Vancouver, and turning the soil of Port Coquitlam into a thick, sucking mud. It is the 23rd of March 1997, a Sunday, and on a sprawling, debris-strewn farm just miles from the civilized world, a woman is fighting for her life. Her name is Wendy. She is a sex worker, a woman familiar with the hard edges of life, familiar with the transactions that happen in the shadows of the downtown East Side. She has been in cars with strangers before. She has navigated the precarious line between survival and danger 1,000 times. But this time is different. This time, the man who picked her up didn't just want a service, he wanted a soul. He drove her to his property, a chaotic, festering plot of land, known to locals as the pig farm. The air here is thick. It smells of manure, of rotting feed, of rust and stagnant water. It smells of death, though Wendy doesn't know that yet. She only knows that the man, a disheveled, frantic figure with wild hair and dirt under his fingernails, has led her into his trailer. Inside, the clutter is suffocating. Piles of junk, dirty clothes, the detritus of a disorganized mind. He offers her money. He offers her drugs. But then, the shift happens. That terrified, electric moment when the predator drops the mask. He grabs her. He slaps a pair of handcuffs onto her left wrist. The metal bites into her skin. The click of the ratchet echoes in the small, sordid space, like a gunshot. Wendy knows, with a clarity that cuts through the drugs and the fear, that if that second cuff clicks shut, she will never leave this trailer alive. She will never walk the streets again. She will simply cease to exist. So she fights. She fights with the desperation of a cornered animal. She grabs a kitchen knife from the counter. She lashes out. She isn't thinking about the law or her future or right and wrong. She is thinking about breath. She is thinking about blood. She slashes him. The blade bites into the man, and he howls, a sound of rage and pain that mingles with the drumming rain on the metal roof. He lunges at her, stabbing her in the abdomen. The pain is blinding, hot and sharp, but she doesn't stop. She scrambles, slipping on the linoleum, kicking, clawing, screaming into the void of the trailer. She manages to break free, stumbling out the door and into the mud. She runs. She runs through the muck that threatens to swallow her boots. She runs past the dark outlines of barns and sheds. She runs until she reaches the road, flagging down a passing car, bleeding, hysterical, half handcuffed, a survivor of a horror movie that hasn't even reached its climax yet. The man, Robert Pickton, goes to the hospital too. He is treated for his wounds, and that night the police descend on the farm. They find the trailer, they find the blood, they find the key to the handcuffs in Pickton's pocket. It seems like an open and shut case. Attempted murder, unlawful confinement, assault with a weapon. They have him. The monster is in the cage. The system has worked, or so it seems, because this is 1997. And in 1997, a glitch is about to occur. A glitch so catastrophic, so negligent, that it will pave the way for a decade of slaughter. Robert Pickton is charged. He is booked. He is held on a $2,000 bond. The prosecutors look at the case, They look at the evidence. They have the victim's testimony. They have the physical wounds. They have the handcuffs. But then, they see a sex worker. They see a drug addict. They see a woman from the margins. Someone society has already decided is broken, unreliable, disposable. They look at Wendy and they don't see a survivor. They see a liability. They worry that a jury won't believe her. They worry that her history of addiction will be used to tear her apart on the stand. They worry about the cost of a trial, the likelihood of a conviction, the messy, complicated reality of prosecuting a crime against a woman the world would rather forget. So, on the 27th of January 1998, the Crown stays the charges. All of them. Attempted murder, stayed. Assault, stayed. Confinement, stayed. The prosecutors enter a nolle prosequi, a Latin phrase that translates roughly to, "We shall no longer prosecute." A frantic, bleeding woman running from a house of horrors wasn't enough. The handcuffs weren't enough. The knife wasn't enough. Robert Pickton walks free. He walks out of the courthouse, not as a convicted felon, not as a man on probation, but as a free citizen. He goes back to his truck. He drives back to Port Coquitlam. He turns down the long, muddy driveway of the pig farm, and he learns a lesson that day, a lesson that will doom dozens of women to a fate worse than death. He learns that he is untouchable. He learns that the women he targets don't matter. He learns that the police don't care, that the courts don't care, that the entire apparatus of justice is blind to the suffering of women from the downtown East Side. He learns that he can hunt without consequence. The glitch in the system didn't just let a criminal go. It created a serial killer. Before 1997, Pickton was dangerous. He was volatile. But after 1998, after the system shrugged and looked the other way, he became efficient. He became prolific. He realized that the farm wasn't just a farm. It was a disposal site, a black hole where he could bring women, use them, kill them, and erase them from the earth. And the disappearances began to accelerate. To understand the magnitude of this failure, you have to understand the hunting ground. Vancouver's downtown east side in the late 90s was a world unto itself. A few square blocks of crumbling hotels, neon-lit bars, and alleyways filled with the lost and the broken. It was a community of survivalists. Women who looked out for each other because no one else would. They were mothers, daughters, sisters. They had dreams that had been derailed by trauma, by addiction, by poverty. They were known as the low-track workers. They stood on street corners in the rain, waiting for a car to slow down, waiting for a window to roll down, hoping for a quick transaction that would get them through the night. They knew the risks. They knew the bad dates. They shared license plate numbers and descriptions of men to avoid. But they didn't know about the pig farmer who had been given a green light by the Canadian justice system. Pickton began to frequent the area with renewed confidence. He was a familiar face. He wasn't the shadowy stranger lurking in the bushes. He was Willie, the guy with the scruffy beard and the goofy grin, the guy who offered money, drugs, alcohol, the guy who seemed harmless, if a bit strange. He was a chameleon of the gutter, blending in with the chaos of the streets. He would drive his beat-up vehicle into the city, cruise the stroll, and pick out his victims. He looked for the most vulnerable, the ones who were dope-sick, the ones who hadn't eaten in days, the ones who were so desperate for a reprieve from the cold and the hunger that they would ignore the alarm bells ringing in their heads. He would promise them a party. "Come back to the farm," he'd say. "We have booze. We have drugs. It's safe." And for many, the promise of a warm trailer and a free fix was irresistible. They would climb into the passenger seat. The door would close, and they would be driven out of the city, away from the lights, away from the safety of numbers, into the darkness of Port Coquitlam. Back at the farm, Pickton had created a twisted playground. He and his brother converted a slaughterhouse on the property into a makeshift nightclub they called The Piggy Palace. It was a place of lawlessness. Bikers, drifters, and local lowlifes would gather there for raves and parties that lasted until dawn. There was free-flowing alcohol. There were drugs. There were women. It was the perfect cover. Who would suspect a serial killer was operating in the middle of a party zone? Who would look for missing women in a place where people were constantly coming and going? The noise, the chaos, the transient nature of the crowd, it all served to mask the true horror of what was happening in the slaughterhouse, in the trailers, in the dirt. The women would arrive. They would party. And then, one by one, they would vanish. Sherry Irving, 24 years old. Gone. Inge Hall, 46. Gone. Sarah de Vries, 28. Gone. Sarah was a writer, a poet, a woman with a sharp mind and a gentle soul who had fallen into the trap of addiction. She kept journals. She wrote about the darkness of the streets, about the fear that stalked the women of the downtown East Side. In one entry, she wrote, "Am I next? Is he watching me now, stalking me like a predator and its prey, waiting for some perfect time, place or moment, waiting for me to make a mistake?" She knew. They all knew. The community whispered about a killer. They whispered about a van. They whispered about the farm. But the police? The police saw nothing. The glitch of 1,997 had set a precedent. The authorities had already decided that crimes against these women were not a priority. When families called to report their daughters missing, they were met with indifference. "She's probably just on a bender," they were told. "She'll turn up. She's transient." She moved to another city. The files were opened, stamped, and filed away. No urgency, no task force, no media outcry. If a university student from a wealthy neighborhood had vanished, the city would have been turned upside down. Helicopters would have scoured the woods. Volunteers would have linked arms to search fields. But for the women of the downtown East Side, there was only silence. And in that silence, Robert Pickton worked. He became a master of disposal. The farm was his factory. He had the tools. He had the machinery. He had the pigs. The details of what happened on that farm are the stuff of nightmares. Details that strain the limits of human comprehension. He didn't just kill these women. He obliterated them. He dismantled them. He used the very apparatus of his trade, the meat grinders, the rendering equipment, to ensure that there was nothing left to find. He bragged about it, in the dark corners of the Piggy Palace, amidst the drunken laughter and the thumping music. He would hint at his power. He felt like a god. He had looked the legal system in the eye in 1997. He had been caught red-handed with a bleeding woman and a knife, and the system had blinked. It had backed down. It had given him permission. So he kept going. 1,998 turned into 1,999. The list of names grew longer. Sheila Egan, Tonya Hoik, Gara Ellis, Andrea Josbury, Mona Wilson. The missing posters began to plaster the telephone poles of the downtown East Side. Faces of smiling young women, frozen in time, staring out at a city that had failed them. The posters layered over each other, a collage of tragedy that thickened with every passing month. The wind would tear them down, the rain would wash the ink away, but new ones would always appear. The families of the victims began to organize. They held vigils. They marched on police headquarters. They screamed until their voices were hoarse, demanding that someone, anyone, pay attention. "Our daughters are being hunted," they cried. "There is a serial killer in Vancouver," but the official line remained the same. There is no evidence of foul play. There is no serial killer. These women are just gone. It was a cognitive dissonance of staggering proportions. The police had the information. They had tips. Informants from the street were telling officers about Willie and the farm. They were talking about the bloody clothes, the jewelry, the strange behavior. In 1998, shortly after the charges were stayed, A tipster told the Vancouver Police Department that Picton was keeping women's purses and IDs in his trailer. Did they raid the farm? Did they surveillance him? Did they bring him in for questioning? No. The jurisdiction was a problem. The farm was in Port Coquitlam, which was RCMP territory. The women were disappearing from Vancouver, which was VPD territory. The two agencies didn't talk. They didn't share databases. They didn't coordinate. It was a bureaucratic chasm into which dozens of lives fell, and Robert Picton knew it. He exploited the cracks in the system, just as surely as he exploited the addictions of his victims. He knew that if he picked them up in one city and killed them in another, the investigation would stall. He knew that if he chose women who were estranged from their families, the reports would be delayed. He was operating with a cold, predatory logic that the police refused to give him credit for. By the turn of the millennium, the farm had become a graveyard. The soil itself was contaminated with the DNA of the missing. The freezers were filled with horrors. And still, the parties continued. The laughter continued. The piggy palace roared on. A carnival of death operating in plain sight. It creates a sickening feeling in the pit of the stomach to realize how preventable this was. To look back at that rainy night in March 1997 and see the fork in the road. Path A. The prosecutors listen to Wendy. They believe her. They look past her addiction and see a victim of a violent crime. They take the case to trial. Maybe they lose, but maybe, just maybe, they win. Maybe Picton goes to prison for 10 years. Maybe he gets counseling. Maybe he is monitored. Even if he gets out, he is on the radar. He is a known violent offender. Path B. They stay the charges. They save a few $1,000s in court costs. They avoid the embarrassment of putting an unreliable witness on the stand. They let him go. They chose Path B, and the cost of that choice wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in human lives. It was measured in the grief of mothers who would never bury their daughters. It was measured in the empty chairs at Christmas dinners, in the children who grew up in foster care wondering why their mothers left them, in the unwritten poems of Sarah DeVries. The glitch wasn't a computer error. It wasn't a filing mistake. It was a moral failure. It was a declaration by the state that some lives are worth less than others. It was a signal that if you are poor, if you are indigenous, if you are addicted, the protection of the law does not extend to you. As 2001 approached, the body count was rising to impossible numbers. The rumors were becoming too loud to ignore. A task force was finally, reluctantly, assembled, but they were looking for a needle in a haystack. And they were years behind. They were chasing a ghost who had been flesh and blood, sitting in their custody 3 years earlier. Picton, meanwhile, was getting sloppy, or perhaps simply more brazen. The invincibility had made him careless. He wasn't just killing anymore. He was hoarding. He kept trophies. He kept clothes. He kept inhalers and prescriptions. The trailer that had been a chaotic mess in 1997 was now a museum of his crimes, packed floor to ceiling with the remnants of the women he had destroyed. He believed he would never be caught. Why would he? He had already beaten the system once. He had looked the devil in the face, and the devil had blinked. But even monsters make mistakes. Even the most protected, overlooked predators eventually trip over their own arrogance. And for Robert Picton, the end wouldn't come from a brilliant detective piecing together the clues. It wouldn't come from a dramatic SWAT raid based on a breakthrough in the missing persons cases. It would come from a gun, not a murder weapon, not a gun used to kill the women, but an illegal firearm, a simple, stupid violation of a weapons charge. In February 2002, a rookie officer from the RCMP, working on a completely unrelated tip about illegal guns being stored at the farm, obtained a search warrant. They weren't looking for bodies. They weren't looking for the missing women. They were looking for an unregistered pistol. It was mundane. It was bureaucratic. It was routine police work. But when they stepped onto that property, When their boots squelched into the mud of the pig farm for the first time in years, the atmosphere shifted. The rookie officer felt it. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. The smell was wrong. The vibe was wrong. They began to search the trailer. They found the gun. But then, they found something else. An asthma inhaler, a small plastic inhaler sitting on a shelf, covered in dust. A common item, unremarkable, except for the name printed on the prescription label, Serena Abotswe. The officer paused. The name sounded familiar. He radioed it in. The dispatcher's voice came back, crackling with static and a sudden sharp tension. Serena Abotswe wasn't just a patient with asthma. She was one of the missing. She was one of the faces on the posters. She had vanished months ago. The officer looked around the trailer. Really looked. And suddenly, the piles of junk weren't just junk. They were evidence. Clothes that didn't belong to a pig farmer. Identification cards. Purses. Jewelry. The glitch was about to be corrected. But it was too late for Serena. It was too late for Mona. It was too late for the dozens of women who had walked down that driveway and never walked back up. The investigation that followed would become the largest in Canadian history. They would sift through the soil of that farm with teaspoons. They would analyze hundreds of thousands of DNA samples. They would find the remains of 33 women. Picton would eventually confess to an undercover officer that he had killed 49. He said he wanted to make it an even 50. He said he was only caught because he got sloppy. But the true tragedy isn't the sloppiness. It isn't even the brutality of the murders themselves. The true tragedy is the timeline. Look at the dates. Look at the names. If the system had worked in 1997, if Wendy's handcuffs and stab wounds had been enough, how many of those 49 women would be alive today? Most of them. Nearly all of the confirmed victims vanished times after times the stay of proceedings. They died because of a decision made in a sterile office by lawyers who thought a trial was too risky. They died because of a prejudice that viewed them as less than. They died because of a glitch. As night falls over the downtown east side today, the rain still comes down. The neon lights still flicker, but the posters are gone, replaced by new ones, new faces, new tragedies. The farm is gone, paved over, erased from the map, but the scar remains. A wound in the psyche of a city that can never fully heal, because we know now what we didn't want to admit then. The monster wasn't hiding in the dark. He was standing in the light, holding a bloody knife, and we simply chose to close our eyes. The air on Fulton Avenue hung heavy and humid on that first day of September, 1998. It was the kind of late summer heat that sticks to your skin, the kind that amplifies the sense of a city exhaust, asphalt, damp earth. But as Detective Skip Manane and his team approached the peeling, grey-shingled house at number 99, the heat amplified something else entirely, a smell, faint at first, masking itself behind the scent of garbage and neglect, but undeniably there. It was a sweet, cloying odor that triggered a primal alarm in the reptilian brain of every officer present, the smell of death. For 2 years, the women of Poughkeepsie had been vanishing from the streets, from the corners, from the margins of a city that had tried its best to look the other way. Wendy, Gina, Kathleen. Names on police reports, faces on flyers that faded in the sun and rain. The community was on edge, whispering about a monster in their midst, while the police chased shadows and dead ends. But the shadows had finally taken a solid form, and that form lived in a hoarding pit of a house, just blocks away from the police station, hiding behind the mask of a friendly, oversized, sloppy former hall monitor named Kendall Francois. The raid hadn't started with a body. It started with a survivor. Just hours earlier, a woman named Christine Sala had burst out of that grey house, terror etched into her features, a story spilling from her lips that was too horrific to be invented. She spoke of a stranglehold, of a fight for her life, of a man who transformed from a gentle giant into a cold-blooded executioner. Her escape was the catalyst, the spark that finally lit the fuse on an investigation that had been smoldering for far too long. Now, the police were at the door. When they breached the entrance, the sensory assault was immediate. The interior of 99 Fulton Avenue wasn't just messy, it was a biological hazard. It was a monument to dysfunction. Piles of newspapers, rotting food, discarded electronics, and mountains of trash created a claustrophobic labyrinth. The floors were buried under feet of debris. The walls were lined with the detritus of a life lived in total chaos. To move through the hallway, the officers had to turn sideways, navigating the narrow canyons of garbage that reached toward the ceiling. Flies buzzed in thick, lazy clouds, agitated by the intrusion, and underneath the smell of rotten trash, that other scent grew stronger. Kendall Francois sat in the interrogation room miles away, calm, polite, eerily detached. He was a large man, heavy-set, with a soft voice that seemed at odds with his physical imposition. He denied everything at first. He played the part of the misunderstood loner, the victim of circumstance. But back at the house, the walls were beginning to talk. Investigators moved deeper into the gloom. The electricity had been cut, casting the cluttered rooms into shadow. Flashlight beams cut through the dust motes, dancing over stacks of adult magazines and empty takeout containers. Every step was treacherous. Every surface was slick with grime. It was a house that breathed, a living organism of filth that seemed to be hiding secrets in its very structure. They began their search on the main floor, picking through the hoard, looking for anything that belonged to the missing women. An earring, a shoe, a purse. But the house had a basement. The door to the lower level was obscured, almost hidden by the accumulation of junk. When they finally cleared the path and opened it, the smell billowed up like a physical blow, staggering the seasoned detectives. It was thick, chemical, and sweet, the stench of decomposition. Detective Manane descended the stairs. The wooden steps creaked under his weight, the sound echoing in the suffocating silence. The air down there was cooler, damp, and heavy, with the metallic tang of dried blood. The beam of his flashlight swept across the dirt floor, illuminating a chaotic jumble of boxes, broken furniture, and piles of laundry. But something wasn't right. The landscape of the basement floor was uneven, disturbed. He moved toward a corner of the room where the earth seemed loose, where the debris had been piled with a specific, frantic intention. He knelt. He brushed aside a layer of trash, and there it was. Not a hand reaching up like in a movie. Not a dramatic reveal. Just the undeniable reality of human remains. A shape wrapped in plastic, buried shallowly in the dirt floor of the basement, treated with less dignity than the garbage that littered the rooms above. The radio crackled to life. "We have a confirmed body." The words hung in the air, changing everything. This was no longer a missing persons case. This was no longer an assault investigation. This was a graveyard. But the horror was just beginning. As the crime scene unit arrived, donning their white Tyvek suits that glowed like ghosts in the dim light of the basement, they began the meticulous, heartbreaking work of unearthing the truth. They cleared the trash. They sifted the soil. And within hours, they found another and another. The basement floor was a puzzle of shallow graves. Kendall Francois hadn't just killed these women. He had kept them. He had lived above them, sleeping, eating, and watching television, while the bodies of his victims lay decomposing just feet beneath him. He had turned his family home into a tomb. The layout of the burials suggested a chilling methodology. There was no ceremony here, no ritual, just disposal. The victims were cramped together, overlapping, hidden under the dirt and the debris. The damp earth of the basement had preserved some evidence, but the decomposition was advanced. The medical examiners would have a nightmare ahead of them identifying these women, giving them back their names, telling the story of their final moments. Wendy Myers, 30 years old. Gina Barone, 29. Kathleen Hurley, 47. These weren't just bodies. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, women who had struggled. Yes, women who had battled addiction and poverty, who had been pushed to the fringes of society, but women who possessed a humanity that Kendall Francois had extinguished with his bare hands. He had targeted them because he thought no one would care. He thought they were invisible. He thought their disappearances would be swallowed by the apathy of the city. He was wrong. As the digging continued, the count rose. 3 bodies. 4 bodies. 5. The basement couldn't contain them all. The investigation moved upward. The attic. The crawl space in the attic was a suffocatingly small area, filled with insulation and dust. It was hot, baking in the late summer sun that beat down on the roof. And there, tucked away in the darkness, shrouded in the stifling heat, they found more. Catherine Marsh, 31. Mary Healy Giacone, 29. Sandra French, 51. 8 women. 8 lives, stolen and stashed away in the architecture of a single suburban house. The scale of the carnage was difficult to comprehend. How does a man live with 8 bodies in his home? How does he wake up in the morning, make coffee, walk out his front door, and smile at his neighbors? How does he maintain the mask of sanity when the very foundation of his existence is built on the bones of his victims? Back in the interrogation room, the facade was crumbling. Confronted with the discovery, faced with the undeniable physical evidence being pulled from his own basement, Kendall Francois slumped. The gentle giant, the polite oddball, the man who had drifted through Poughkeepsie like a harmless ghost, finally let the mask slip. He began to talk, and when he talked, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. He didn't speak with rage, he didn't speak with passion. He spoke with a terrifying, clinical detachment. He described the murders as if he were recounting a grocery list. He told them how he lured the women, how he brought them back to the squalor of 99 Fulton Avenue, how he strangled them. He described the mechanics of death, the struggle, the silence, the weight of a body going limp. He admitted to the sexual nature of the crimes, confirming what the profile had suggested, but what the community had feared to articulate. He was a sexual sadist, a man who derived gratification not just from the act of killing, but from the total possession of his victims. By keeping them, by burying them in his own home, he was maintaining that control even after death. They were his. In his twisted, diseased mind, they belonged to him. The excavation of 99 Fulton Avenue took days. It was a slow, grueling process that traumatized even the most hardened investigators. The house had to be dismantled from the inside out. Every shovel of dirt, every bag of trash, every piece of evidence had to be catalogued. The smell clung to the officers' uniforms, to their skin, to their hair. It was a scent that many of them would never be able to scrub away. Outside, the neighborhood watched in stunned silence. Police tape fluttered in the breeze. News vans clogged the streets. The residents of Poughkeepsie looked at the house they had passed 1,000 times, the house with the overgrown lawn, the house with the weird guy who always waved hello, and realized they had been living next to the mouth of hell. The disconnect was jarring. Kendall Francois was a monitor at the local middle school. He was known to the local police, but as a nuisance, a weirdo, not a predator. He had been invisible in the way that matters most dismissed as harmless because he didn't fit the cinematic image of a monster. He wasn't charming like Bundy. He wasn't a clown like Gacy. He was just Kendall, the guy who smelled a bit bad, the guy whose house was a mess. But inside that mess, he had constructed a slaughterhouse. The discovery in the basement revealed the catastrophic failure of the system. Several of the women had filed complaints against Francois before they disappeared. Christine Sala wasn't the first to escape. She was just the first to be fully heard. There were reports of assaults, of strange behavior, of women running from his house half naked and terrified. But because the victims were sex workers, because they were addicts, because they lived on the jagged edges of the city, their stories were often dismissed. Credibility issues, the police called it. Francois knew this. He banked on it. He weaponized the marginalized status of his victims, using society's indifference as his shield. He knew that a missing prostitute didn't ring the same alarm bells as a missing college student. He operated in that gap, that blind spot, where vulnerable people fall through the cracks. But the cracks had finally opened up. The basement had been unearthed. As the coroner's vans pulled away, one by one, carrying the remains of the 8 women, a heavy silence fell over Fulton Avenue. The 1,998 unearthing wasn't just about finding bodies. It was about exposing a truth that the city had tried to ignore. It forced Poughkeepsie to look in the mirror, to acknowledge that while Francois was the killer, the environment that allowed him to operate for 2 years, the apathy, the judgment, the dismissal of the less dead, was a co-conspirator. Inside the house, the silence was absolute. The flies still buzzed, the trash still rotted, but the secret was out. The basement was empty now, save for the dirt and the dark stains that saturated the soil. The evil that had lived there, the presence that had filled the rooms with dread, had been extracted. Kendall Francois was in a cell, watching the walls, stripped of his power, stripped of his secrets. But for the families of the 8 women, the nightmare wasn't ending. It was just shifting shape. They now had bodies to bury. They had answers. But those answers were jagged and painful. They had to reconcile the memory of their loved ones with the horrific reality of their final resting place. The media called it the House of Horrors. A cliché, perhaps, but fitting. Because true horror isn't always a supernatural force or a masked intruder. Sometimes, true horror is just a dirty house on a quiet street, a man with a soft voice, and a basement floor that isn't quite level. And as September rolled on, cooling into autumn, the people of Poughkeepsie walked a little faster past 99 Fulton Avenue. They locked their doors a little tighter. They looked at their neighbors a little more closely, because they had learned the hardest lesson of all. Monsters don't always hide in the dark. Sometimes, they wave at you from the front porch. The investigation was technically over. The killer was caught. The bodies were found. But the psychological excavation was just beginning. The unearthing of the basement had revealed the bodies, but it hadn't explained the why. Why does a human being break in this specific, terrible way? What triggers the switch from man to monster? Kendall Francois offered no profound insights, no philosophical manifestos. He was a void, a black hole that had consumed 8 lives simply because he could, because he wanted to, because for 2 years, nobody stopped him. The tragedy of the Poughkeepsie murders wasn't just the brutality of the deaths, it was the solitude of them. Each woman had died alone, in the squalor of that house, with only their killer for company, and for months, or years, they had lain in the dark, waiting for someone to come, waiting for the light of a flashlight to cut through the gloom and say, "We found you. You matter." It took too long. It took far too long. But on that humid September day in 1998, they were finally found. The basement gave up its dead, and the silence was finally broken. Robert Ben Rhodes was, by all accounts, a ghost in the machine of American commerce. He was the man in the lane next to you, the shadow in the truck stop diner, the unremarkable figure sipping coffee while the world moved on around him. He paid his taxes. He followed traffic laws. He delivered his cargo on time. But beneath that veneer of the hard-working blue-collar traveler, beneath the polite smiles and the innocuous small talk, lived a monster of calculated depravity. He didn't just kill. He collected. He didn't just destroy, he savored, and for 15 years, he turned the open road into his personal hunting ground, using the anonymity of the interstate to mask the screams of his victims. The tragedy of this case isn't just the brutality of the crimes, but the catastrophic silence that allowed them to continue. Rhodes thrived on the gaps in our system. He exploited the disconnect between state troopers and local sheriffs, between missing persons reports in Texas and unidentified bodies in Illinois. In an era before digital databases connected the dots, he was invisible. He understood that if you kept moving, you kept your freedom. He turned the vastness of the American landscape into a weapon, using the miles between crime scenes to wash his hands clean. The system wasn't broken, it was simply blind. It saw a truck driver with a clean record. It failed to see the predator with a mobile torture chamber parked in the sleeper cab. And that chamber is what haunts us. The sleeper, as he called it. It wasn't just a place to rest, it was a feat of engineering, designed for human suffering. He had modified the cab of his truck with handcuffs bolted to the walls, with whips, with surgical instruments laid out with terrifying precision. It was a dungeon on 18 wheels, a rolling hell, where he played God, deciding who lived, who died, and how much pain they would endure before the end. He took the concept of the domestic serial killer and put it on the highway, ensuring that no matter where he went, his dark fantasies traveled with him. But we must not let the darkness of his invention overshadow the light of those he tried to extinguish. We have to remember the resilience of the women who found themselves trapped in that metal box. Women like Jennifer Berry, whose terrifying final moments we can only imagine, and the survivors who managed to escape the inescapable. They were not just victims, they were fighters. They were daughters and sisters who stared into the abyss of one man's twisted soul and saw the true face of evil. Their stories remind us that while the system may fail, the human spirit's will to survive is a force that even monsters like Rhodes couldn't fully conquer. He stripped them of their dignity, their safety, and their lives. But he could not strip away the truth of what he was. Rhodes is now behind bars, a caged animal no longer able to prowl the asphalt veins of the country. But the questions he left behind remain. How many others are out there, slipping through the jurisdiction lines? How many other monsters are hiding behind the wheel of a vehicle we pass every day? The realization that such elaborate mechanical evil can exist in plain sight is a pill that is hard to swallow. We want to believe that monsters look like monsters. We want to believe that torture chambers are things of fiction, or at least things that stay in one place. But here is the terrifying reality. Rhodes wasn't the only one. He wasn't even the most ambitious. While the truck stop killer was modifying his vehicle to torment victims on the go, another man in the New Mexico desert was taking the concept of a torture chamber to a level that defies comprehension. He didn't just modify a truck. He built an entire soundproof trailer from scratch, filling it with machinery so complex and diabolical that the FBI agents, who found it needed therapy just to process what they were seeing. If you think the mobile dungeon was a nightmare, you haven't stepped inside the toy box. Click this video right here to uncover the story of David Parker Ray and see just how deep the rabbit hole of calculated evil truly goes.